So now it is time to introduce our minister. Reverend Rick Davis is with us today with his wife, Gordana, and they're here from the congregation in Salem. And today he's going to be speaking to us about the idea of confession. Thank you for being here.
Sure. This is not my first time here, as you well know, some of you, so it's always good to be in Big Midville. It's amazing how time passes, but I watched this group come in, and I'm just so happy to see you guys continuing. Look at this room, too. This is really great. This is great. So it's been a long time since I started in the ministry. I've been in Salem for 30 years. I can't believe it. I was in Emerson Unitarian Church in Canoga Park, California for 6 years before that. But before that, I was an intern minister in San Diego, California. And so I was serving as an intern minister there, trying to get used to the various roles of ministry. And a friend that I had met in San Diego asked me if I would be willing to hear his confession. Right? He was working through a 12-step program that required him to address certain wrongdoings to another person and to God. And although I wasn't sure about this is not standard UU ministerial practices, so I will not come over here to hear your confessions. Not what I do, but I wanted to be helpful to him, so I agreed to hear his confession, which, in my opinion, was a big nothing burger. What he confessed reminded me of the Catholic bishop who complained that hearing all the nuns' confessions was like being stoned to death with popcorn. Sense just didn't really register. My friend's confessions of what he thought, he was a young man, he thought he was having inappropriate sexual fantasies never acted upon, and they were pieces of popcorn, because suffice it to say, I wasn't troubled by his confession of being a human being and having normal feelings and appetites. I was troubled by his sense of guilt for feeling that he needed to feel guilty. It's an odd thing, you know, because you might feel guilt. It doesn't mean that you're guilty, only that you feel like you're guilty of something. And this is a problem. It also works the other way. You might be feeling no guilt when you probably should be feeling some guilt. So it's hard to figure it out. It's all a mess. You can see from just a cursory study of the history of confessional practices and say the Christian tradition, other traditions have them too, there has been and continues to be a messy confusion as to whether or not there should be rituals of confession and how this should be done and to what effect. And in the popular imagination, fueled by many movie scenes, confession appears to be this perfunctory, often insincere ritual shorn of any deep or true meaning. This wasn't something, going to confession, I'm from a Southern Baptist background, it wasn't something that got my full attention because it had never been part of my spiritual life. Feeling bad, confessing my sin to somebody else, and then feeling better until another backlog of sins compels further confession, and so on and so on. That seemed more like a treadmill than a path of growth. So I never even thought about this kind of thing. And in fact, it was to get away from meaningless rite and ritual performed on autopilot that I migrated over to Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism. This was in my early adult years, and those who witnessed my ministry in Salem can tell that Buddhist practice and teaching are woven into the tapestry of my ministry, as are other traditions and practices and passions. So it's all mixed in together, for me anyway. That's why I'm a UU, because I can do that. If you become somewhat involved in Zen Buddhist practice, and there's a monastery or center somewhere nearby, you're going to be urged, once you've settled into your meditation practice just a little bit, you're going to be urged to go on what they call a sesshin. A sesshin, it's an intensive meditation retreat. It's multi-day meditation marathon. That's a good way to think of it. It's a multi-day meditation marathon. You meditate a lot, more than you ever would do on your own. And it sounds maybe blissful. Go and meditate. Well, it's actually, for me at least, and for most people too, it was an intensely grueling experience. I've been to some of these sessions over the years, and I have suffered physically, hence mentally, because I had trouble with my sitting posture because of a personal condition I had. It had steadily and significantly improved over the years, thank goodness, but sessions were really challenging. So imagine you're having to sit still. Each period of meditation is 40 minutes, and you don't move. However you're sitting, that's it. No moving. You can move maybe once or twice, but after that, you're going to be chastised. So it's really hard. And yet the communal resolve is that we're going to do this. We're going to sit there together. We're not going to move too much. And even when you are in some pain or discomfort, you don't run away from it. You just kind of sit with it. Not much fun. And you might wonder why the heck anyone would put themselves through such an ordeal. And in a word, it's transformation. Transformation. That is the transformation of your perspective, your awareness of your interconnectivity, your appreciation for this life. And this manifests in many ways, as I discovered during a chant at one particular retreat I went to outside of Portland a number of years ago. Now, chanting, I get into it for the meditation. Chanting was never really much my things, but I go along with all the chanting because this is what you do in these settings. Like, there was this ancient ritual chant we did on the very first morning and every succeeding morning of this retreat. It's known as the Verse of Atonement. The Verse of Atonement. Everybody's chanting together, and we say, all the evil karma ever committed by me since of old, on account of my beginningless greed and anger and ignorance, born of my body, mouth, and thought, I now atone for it all. So we did that chant on that first morning, and as I chanted on that first morning, there was no atoning on my part. I was just saying the words. My heart wasn't in it, nor was I convinced that my heart needed to be in it. But then the next morning, we did the same chant, but something had changed me. I didn't have the same reaction to this chant as I had the first day. Somehow, the challenge of sitting still with several dozen other good people on a communal spiritual quest had created a crack in my heart where some light could get in. And to describe the transformation of awareness I had, consider the perspective of a parent. I know we have parents here. We have a lot of kids too. It's so wonderful to see so many kids here. As a parent, you love your child so dearly. And if somehow you became aware that you have been withholding love or giving it in the wrong way or doing something that was standing in the way of your child's fulfillment and happiness, you would instantly take this to heart because your love for your child trumps any need to defend or justify yourself. Love makes such concerns completely irrelevant. You just want what's best for your child. And during the meditation, without realizing it, because I was in so much pain, I seemed to have developed a tender affection for my fellow practitioners, many of whom were struggling just like me. But we were doing this to deepen our wisdom and awareness. And you can come to have this spacious state of mind where you really want the best for everyone and for every being. And when you feel that way, and you feel that way, and you chant in unison with others, you are instantly aware that you have been indeed less than loving, fully loving in so many ways. Less than fully caring, less than fully kind, less than fully aware of your surroundings. And you yearn to atone, not out of a sense of guilt, but out of a sense of love. And that's why I think I was crying that morning as we were chanting. I was doing this chant, and I was doing this atonement. And then the first day, it was just a ritual. And then the next day, it's like, yeah, there's something here. There's something I needed to do to acknowledge that I'm part of the grand scheme of things. And what I realized, in a nutshell, is that authentic and restorative confession only happens from the perspective of a loving mind state, where you can become aware of the unloving parts of your life. And when you do that, you immediately have a wholesome inward confessional response to this, and you want to renew and practice your love in more skillful ways. In the Christian tradition, such newfound spiritual awareness is called metanoia. An important word to know. It's a changing of the heart and mind, and it points you in a new direction, a new life orientation, in the service of love for others, for all beings. And that can play out in an infinite variety of ways, according to your own gifts and passions. Yet this change in my consciousness, it would probably not have happened if I had been chanting alone. Actually, I don't chant alone. I do a little bit, actually. I've started it. But this power of everyone, palms together, chanting these words in unison. Even the Zen masters, nobody bows out of this chant. It just creates an awareness that we're more alike than we're different. And we're all of us in this together. And when each one of us acknowledges our loving responsibilities, our sense of interconnectedness, then we're all blessed. And so this chant came from my heart now. It was authentic, and it did feel like a moment of atonement, atonement. So this confessional moment didn't feel to me like as if we were self-flagellating. In fact, paradoxically, this moment of true humility, where I was just owning up for being a less than perfect human being, it was actually very spiritually exalting. I felt more connected and more enlivened. And given my experience and the similar experiences of countless others, you can well understand how the great religious traditions have confessional practices, or at least they try to have them, that offer us paths back to interconnection and to atonement. It's important to become aware of such paths because there's so many paths that lead in the opposite direction. Those paths that disconnect you from the larger whole, the greater good. And so often you find yourself on this path not because you're a bad person. Often it's because of the hand you got dealt in the way your life is playing out. Over the years, I've heard from a few veterans who signed up for the service, or they were conscripted to serve. And they ended up being placed in situations where unspeakable horrors happened, terrible things, the visions of which will haunt them to the end of their days. Some of them killed other people because this was their job, and they were ordered to fulfill it. And then the madness of violence and vengeance took over, and it's just ugly stuff. One great sorrow here is that people, often veterans who are put in such positions, and many people who are put in difficult situations, they suffer from what is known as moral injury. Moral injury. How many of you have heard that phrase before? It's a really interesting concept to explore, moral injury. That's damage that's done to one's conscience. It turns out that we are not amoral beings, that we have an inner moral compass, a sense of connection to the larger whole. And when we damage or destroy that connection, it not only harms other people, it also harms us. Those who suffer from great moral injury become disconnected. And this is an identifiable condition. The psychologists, they name it. Those who suffer from moral injury, they are disconnected from having faith in themselves. They don't even trust that they're good people anymore. They become trapped in realms of anger and anguish and alienation. Moral injury. It's a real condition. The most extreme case of moral injury I know of comes from the Buddhist tradition. And I used to share this story with the men at the Oregon State Penitentiary in a connection type group that I facilitated there for several years. I really enjoyed that work. None of my guys had gotten into the maximum security prison for good reasons, and none of them claimed to be innocent. Yet I was also sorrowfully aware that they had landed behind bars in some large measure because of the hand they had been dealt at birth. And I really came to care about these guys. I really came to care about these guys. And one way I cared about them was to tell them the ancient story of Angulimala. Angulimala, one of the disciples of the Buddha, about 25 centuries ago. If you haven't heard of Angulimala, today you're going to hear of him. And you should remember him. Quite a guy. Quite a guy. But you wouldn't think it if you knew him at the beginning of his career. We're not unfamiliar with his type today. Angulimala was a rough equivalent of a religious terrorist today who murders other people in the name of their faith. And as the story goes, Angulimala was betrayed by jealous fellow students, and he was duped by an evil guru who commanded him to murder 1,000 people. It's a tragic story in which an idealistic young man gets ensnared in the evil designs of others. It's almost like you could think today somebody surfing the web, a young disconnected person could get into a terrorist organization thinking they were being idealistic. It happens. Angulimala was an incredibly powerful man, and he did murder people. In fact, he murdered, according to the legend, 999 people, and he made a garland out of their finger bones, a word around his neck. This is ghoulish, ghastly stuff. This is just awful stuff. Angulimala was a monster. And he had one more victim to meet his goal of 1,000. One afternoon he saw a wandering monk all alone in the forest where he often committed his atrocious deeds. But this monk was the Buddha, who knew all about Angulimala and in fact had gone to the forest precisely to encounter him. It would be one of the most momentous encounters in early Buddhist history. So let's try to imagine the scene. Of course, we're far removed from the historical figure known as the Buddha, but there can be no doubt, at least I don't have any doubt, that he was one of the most exceptional people who ever walked the earth, gifted with a great heart and a great mind, someone who peered into the heart of reality and achieved a liberation that gave him an unspeakable peace of mind and a radiant heart of compassion. And so here's the Buddha, and Angulimala is running towards the Buddha, and he's expecting the Buddha to run in terror like everybody else. But the Buddha, he's dwelling in a realm of bliss and freedom beyond all fear. He smiles with infinite tenderness at Angulimala. I remember that Angulimala had once been an idealistic and gifted student led badly astray. And in the Buddha's presence, his loving self, Angulimala's loving self, was reawakened. And he became utterly undone to recognize how dreadfully unloving he had been. And he fell to the Buddha's feet. He took refuge in his teachings, teachings that would liberate him, even the worst of criminals, from his hellish state of mind. Undoubtedly, over the years, this very ancient story that I just told you of this conversion, it's been embellished, probably, but the story has a grain of truth to it, and it does let us know that the Buddha welcomed a robber and a murderer into his Sangha, the monastic community, because the Buddha knew that Angulimala was something more than his worst deeds, that he was worthy of compassion in spite of all that he had done to others. In the light of the Buddha's love, Angulimala's love was awakened, and now he was fully aware of the horrid, unloving nature of his past actions. He threw his weapons over a cliff, and he began a new life in the Sangha, eventually attaining saintly status. It was an absolutely amazing transformation. Of course, the villagers didn't get it at first, and for years, they still hated and abused him because of his past actions, but Angulimala just bore it. He never fought back. He never defended himself. He knew he had it coming, and he accepted this abuse. But over time, his reputation for loving kindness grew to such an extent that he became, and this is how Angulimala is known in Asian Buddhist lands today, he is known as the special protector of women and children. How about that for a change in quite a trajectory from being a mass murderer to the special protector of women and children? That's how Angulimala, the Buddhist disciple, is remembered today. And as I told this story in the prison, it was apparent to my good friends behind bars while I was telling them, these morally injured souls, this particular story. It's a reminder that is congruent with our universalist tradition, which is that no one lies outside the circle of love's restorative power. That's our universalist tradition. It's one of the reasons I'm a UU. No one lies outside the circle of love's restorative powers. No matter how morally injured, no matter how far you may have strayed in the wrong direction, a love that never gives up shines a light in the darkest places. But what about us? What are our practices of confession as Unitarian Universalists? Many years ago, the Unitarian minister Thomas R. King noted that Universalists believe that God is too good to damn them, and Unitarians believe they're too good to be damned. And I think they're both true. So we don't need confession to appease a wrathful God, or because we are inherently evil or a bunch of miserable sinners. We come together into our religious communities like this because these are houses of love. Love is our doctrine in the Unitarian Universalist movement, as I understand it. Love is our doctrine. And so we can all look at our lives in the light of love and find our own roads, our own paths to atonement as we need to. That's all. I've got it anyway. I usually end my sermons in Salem with just a brief silent meditation. Just take a deep breath and allow yourself to process what you've heard. And now I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, so we're going to still do the meditation just a little bit shorter today, so I think I do this first.
So, meditate quickly.
Okay, so we have a business meeting after this today, so I think we're gonna slide past the dialogue, maybe just have some internal dialogue. And we're gonna talk, I think, Brian, are you guys gonna introduce the pledge drive kickoff information?
We will.
Awesome, thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right, so Brian and Conrad are gonna talk to us about the pledge drive kickoff.
This is our pledge drive brochure, and if you need one, raise your hand. You have it, Susan? And Susan will bring you one if you need it. Thanks, Chris. Is this on now? It is. That's good. This little pamphlet, a little brochure, is just a way of bowing to this congregation. What an amazing group.
Okay, that song has been so much fun to practice. Thank you, Bryn. That was so much fun. Oh my gosh. Okay.